Chapter 5. Echoes of the Past. The days continued to pass slowly, and as the weeks turned into months, Elias and Lyra had adapted to their new life. They had learned to live off the land, scavenging what they could, hunting, foraging, and even beginning to construct a more permanent shelter. The shelter they had built was small, but it had become home. Their little corner of the world was surrounded by towering trees, vast fields of strange grasses that seemed to shimmer in the sunlight, and deep caverns that echoed with the sound of life, both dangerous and harmless. But life wasn't just about survival anymore. It had become about growth. Elias could see the changes in Lyra, how she was slowly returning to herself in ways that felt almost miraculous. There was a brightness in her eyes now, one that hadn't been there when he first found her. She no longer stared out at the sky with fear and distrust. She was beginning to smile again, albeit in quiet, fleeting moments. And yet, despite all of these changes, there were still shadows that lingered beneath the surface. One evening, after a long day of gathering resources, they sat around a fire that flickered softly in the night. Lyra's eyes were fixed on the flames, but Elias could tell her mind wasn't fully present. She had grown quiet over the past few days, almost distant. It was a subtle shift, but he noticed it. It was as though something was weighing on her heart. "Lyra, what's wrong?" Elias asked, his voice gentle but filled with concern. He didn't want to push, but he had grown to know her in ways that made him realize when something was troubling her. She had become like family, the bond they shared growing deeper every day. And like family, he cared about her well-being. Lyra didn't answer right away. She stared at the fire, her expression unreadable, her small fingers absently tracing the edge of a rock by her side. Elias waited, patient as ever. The silence stretched on until finally, her voice broke through it, quiet and tinged with a sadness that Elias hadn't expected. "I had a dream last night," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I dreamed of my people, my home, the stars, the voices I used to hear. I saw them all again. And when I woke up, it hurt. It hurt to know it was just a dream." Elias frowned, understanding immediately. The weight of the past was never far from Lyra. It lived in the quiet moments, in the flash of memories that she couldn't escape. It haunted her, and Elias could see how it gnawed at her even in the peace they had managed to carve out. "Lyra, I'm sorry," he said quietly. He had no idea what it must have been like to have everything you knew and loved ripped away in an instant. "I know I can't bring them back, but you've survived, and you're stronger than you know. You don't have to forget them, but you can live for yourself now." Lyra turned to look at him, her eyes wide, filled with a mixture of gratitude and pain. "I don't know how to live without them," she whispered. "I don't know how to move on from that. I was one of them, a warrior. But now, all I have are these memories, these ghosts." Elias reached out, placing his hand on hers. He gave her a firm, supportive squeeze, wishing there was more he could say, more he could do to ease the burden she carried. "You don't have to carry those memories alone anymore. And I'm not going to let them consume you. Whatever happened to you, we can work through it together." Lyra looked down at their joined hands, her face softening. Slowly, she nodded. "I don't know how to begin, Elias. But I think I want to try to begin again." Her words felt like a turning point. Something shifted in her, and Elias could see it, the small steps forward she was willing to take, the subtle opening of her heart. She was starting to heal, and though it was slow, it was real. And that, Elias thought, was all that mattered. Chapter 6. A New Path. The following weeks brought more changes. The quiet, gradual life they had established now had a new purpose. Lyra had begun to show a curiosity about the stars again, something she hadn't done since her world was destroyed. She would gaze up at the night sky, watching the constellations with the wonder of someone rediscovering an old love. Elias noticed how her face softened when she did, how her fingers traced the shapes in the sky as if trying to remember the old names of the stars, the stories her people had once told. They spent days gathering supplies, more permanent shelters, tools, and even experimenting with growing some plants that Lyra had identified as having medicinal properties. The days were filled with hard work, but there was something satisfying in it, something grounding. Elias worked as though he had a purpose again, and Lyra, though hesitant at first, found herself taking pride in what they were building. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about creating a future. One afternoon, while Elias was out scavenging for wood, Lyra came across something that caught her attention deep in the woods. It was a strange structure, half buried under overgrown vines and twisted roots. She had never seen anything like it before, an ancient, weathered piece of technology that hummed faintly with an energy she didn't understand. Her heart quickened. She recognized the markings on the surface, alien symbols, faint but unmistakable. The device was old, very old, but it was also unmistakably advanced. It hummed with a subtle energy, as if waiting to be activated. She knelt beside the relic, her fingers brushing over its surface. A rush of memories flooded back, images of the war, of her people, of the strange technologies they had once used to communicate across the stars. Could this be one of their lost artifacts? Had it survived the destruction of her planet? Elias, she called, her voice a mix of excitement and uncertainty. You need to see this. Elias came running at the sound of her voice, his eyes wide with curiosity. When he saw the device, he froze, recognizing the unfamiliar markings as well. Where did you find this? He asked, his voice filled with awe. He crouched beside her, reaching out to inspect the device more closely. I don't know, Lyra replied, her voice shaking slightly. But I think it's from my people. From before the war. Elias's gaze shifted from the device to her, realization dawning on him. This wasn't just a discovery. It was a piece of Lyra's past, her people's past. It was something that could reconnect her to her roots, to the very thing that had been taken from her. What do you think it is? He asked. I'm not sure, Lyra said. But maybe it's a way to communicate. A way to reach out to what's left of my people. Maybe I can find them. Elias's heart swelled with a mixture of hope and disbelief. They hadn't been searching for something like this, not actively, at least, but here it was, right in front of them. A lifeline for Lyra, a way to bridge the vast distance between her and her past. It could be dangerous, Elias said, his voice cautious but supportive. We don't know what it does. It could be damaged or unstable. I know, Lyra replied softly, but I can't ignore it. This could be my chance to reconnect with what's left. I have to try. Elias nodded, understanding the importance of this moment for her. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about hope. It was about finding a way to reclaim the pieces of herself she had lost. He wasn't going to stop her. He would help her, no matter what. Together, they spent the next few days carefully working on the device. They studied its surface, the markings, and the subtle hum of energy that flowed through it. Elias used all his knowledge of tech, while Lyra offered insight into the ancient technology of her people. Slowly, they began to unlock its secrets. And then, one day, after weeks of working tirelessly, the device responded. A faint light flickered, and a low, resonant voice, alien and ancient, spoke from the device. It was a language Lyra had not heard in years, the language of her people, the language of the stars. Her breath caught in her throat as the message began to unfold, speaking of survival, of hope, of those who had survived the destruction of their planet. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give Lyra something she hadn't had in a long time, a sense of purpose. I can hear them, Lyra whispered, tears filling her eyes. They're still out there. They survived. Elias stood behind her, his heart swelling with emotion. You're not alone anymore, Lyra. You never were. And in that moment, as the first rays of hope pierced the dark expanse of the universe, Elias realized that no matter what dangers they would face in the future, they were no longer defined by their pasts. They were defined by the choices they made, the paths they chose to walk, and the people they chose to become. They had found a way forward. Together, the days after Lyra had activated the mysterious device were nothing short of transformative. For the first time since the destruction of her people, a spark of hope flickered inside her, something that felt real. The messages coming from the device were fragmented, but they were enough to confirm what Lyra had feared. Her people had survived the initial attack. They weren't extinct, as she had come to believe, but scattered across the galaxy, hiding from the same destructive forces that had annihilated their planet. Elias and Lyra spent countless hours working on the device, trying to decode its messages and determine if it could provide more concrete information. The language was alien, yes, but there were enough familiar symbols that Lyra recognized the structure of the sentences, allowing her to slowly translate the fragments. The more they learned, the more Elias understood the importance of what they had found. This was not just a relic, it was a beacon, a lifeline to a people who had been silenced by war. As they decoded the message further, Elias saw the transformation in Lyra. She was no longer the frightened, broken girl who had stumbled into his life. She was becoming the person she was meant to be, a survivor, a leader, a beacon of hope for the people who still lived in the shadows of the galaxy. But as the message became clearer, it also became apparent that there was more to this relic than Lyra had anticipated. The message wasn't just about survival. It spoke of something far more dangerous, a call to arms, a gathering of survivors in preparation for the return of the Zidarians, the very force that had ravaged their homeworld. "Lyra, you've got to see this," Elias said one evening, his voice urgent. He had been working late into the night, tweaking the device to try and capture more of the signal. When the message finally transmitted, Lyra joined him by the device. Her eyes widened as she read the translation. "It's a rallying call," she whispered in disbelief. "They're preparing for something. A counterattack. They're coming for the Zidarians." Elias paused, processing what she was saying. "They're going to fight back. But against an empire like that, it sounds dangerous." "It is," Lyra replied, her voice low. "But I have to help them. I can't just hide here anymore. They need me." Elias watched her, seeing the intensity in her eyes. It was clear that Lyra wasn't just surviving anymore, she was choosing to act, to fight for her people, to reclaim the life she had lost. It was a turning point, not just for her, but for them both. There was no turning back now. "We'll need allies," Elias said, breaking the silence. "And more resources. You can't do this alone, Lyra. No matter how much you want to." Lyra's face softened for a moment, the edges of a smile tugging at her lips. "I know. I'm not alone anymore, am I?" Elias shook his head. "No, you're not." He felt the weight of the promise they had made to each other, an unspoken pact that bound them together, not out of necessity, but out of mutual respect. In the quiet moments of survival, they had found something deeper. They had found a reason to keep going. The following days were filled with preparations. They began to gather what supplies they could from the wreckage of the alien ship and the surrounding area. Food, medical supplies, tools, anything that would help them survive in the coming days. The storm was relentless, and the terrain was treacherous, but Elias and Lyra had become a well-oiled team. They knew how to rely on each other, to trust that they could overcome whatever obstacles lay ahead. Still, Lyra's focus was clear. She was no longer thinking about just surviving. She was preparing herself to rejoin her people, to fight back against the very enemy that had torn her world apart. The relic continued to hum with energy, its transmissions providing new coordinates and guidance. Lyra, once uncertain about her future, now had a purpose: to find the survivors, to unite the scattered factions of her people, and to lead them in the fight against the Zidarians. But Elias knew that her path would be fraught with danger. The Zidarians were relentless, and even with this newfound hope, the odds were still stacked against them. "We'll make it," Elias said quietly as they worked late into the night, the soft hum of the device filling the room. Lyra glanced at him, the weight of their shared journey settling over them both. "Yes, we will." Chapter 7. The Call to Arms. The morning came swiftly after the long, restless night spent poring over the device. Elias had learned everything he could about it, and despite the overwhelming complexity of its data, the message was clear: Lyra's people were not gone, and they were preparing to strike back. But there was another part of the message, one that haunted Lyra's thoughts. It was a map, coordinates to a hidden location, a place where the survivors were gathering, a place where the final stand against the Zidarians would take place. Lyra knew this journey would take her far from the quiet life they had built on this isolated planet, but she had no choice. The survival of her people, of what remained of her culture, depended on it. For days, they prepared for the journey. They couldn't stay hidden forever. Elias worked tirelessly to patch up their ship, the wreckage of which had been buried deep in the wilds of the planet. With Lyra's help, they gathered fuel and supplies, ensuring that they could make the long journey across the galaxy. Lyra had given him everything she had: her trust, her knowledge of the galaxy, and the fragments of her people's history, and in return, Elias had given her a promise. He would never let her face this alone. They had no idea what awaited them, but the map Lyra had decoded was their first step towards something bigger. They had no idea how they would navigate the vast distances between them and the hidden survivors. They didn't even know if there were still any survivors left to find. But the idea of failing, of letting her people be lost forever, was something neither of them could accept. Lyra stood by the ship, her gaze distant as she stared at the stars. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what she was about to do. It wasn't just a physical journey, it was an emotional one, too. She had spent so long running, hiding, trying to forget the destruction of her world, but now she had to face it. She had to face the possibility that she might be too late, that the remnants of her people might be lost to the void. "We're ready," Elias said, walking up beside her, his voice calm but determined. Lyra nodded, a small, fragile smile forming on her lips. "Then let's go." With that, they boarded the ship, their hearts heavy with uncertainty, but also filled with something else, something more powerful than fear: hope. They fired the engines, and the ship slowly lifted off the ground, disappearing into the sky, heading toward the coordinates Lyra had uncovered. As the planet grew smaller behind them, Lyra allowed herself a moment to breathe, to look ahead at the unknowns before them. The road ahead would be perilous, and there was no guarantee of success. But with Elias by her side, she felt ready. Ready to reclaim her past, ready to fight for a future. The stars stretched before them, a vast expanse of unknown worlds. Lyra knew that this was only the beginning of a journey that would define her people's future. And for the first time since the destruction of her home, she felt a flicker of peace. Because she wasn't alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, they would succeed in the fight for survival and freedom. The end, or a new beginning. The ship cut through the atmosphere with a soft hum, the engines purring steadily as they ascended into the cold, infinite expanse of space. Lyra stared at the viewport, the vibrant blue of the planet fading behind them, leaving only the void before them. Her mind was racing, but the calming hum of the engines helped center her, grounding her in the present moment. Elias was at the controls, his fingers moving deftly across the ship's interface, navigating their route with precision. They had a long journey ahead of them, one that would take them across a vast expanse of space. But despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead, Lyra found herself feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The coordinates on the map were far from reassuring. The galaxy was a vast, unpredictable place, and there were no guarantees they would find the survivors in time. But the message had been clear. There was a hidden refuge, a safe haven for those who had escaped the wrath of the Zidarians. Lyra's people hadn't been eradicated, they had scattered, regrouped, and they were waiting for the right moment to strike back. The sound of Elias's voice broke through her thoughts, pulling her back into the moment. "We'll need to adjust the course slightly. I'm picking up some unusual readings. Could be a patrol or some kind of interference." Lyra's stomach tightened. She had never been fully at ease traveling through the galaxy. With every ship they passed, every unexplained signal, there was a lingering fear that they could be discovered, captured. The Zidarians were still out there, and while they were searching for survivors, they could just as easily be searching for her. The thought of being found, of being dragged back to that hellish place, made her skin crawl. "Can you shake them off?" Lyra asked, her voice low, betraying the anxiety she was trying to suppress. Elias nodded, his eyes focused on the screen as he adjusted their trajectory. "I can make it look like we're just another freighter, no need for alarms. We'll stay off their radar as much as possible. We'll be fine, Lyra." Her gaze drifted to his profile, to the quiet determination that emanated from him. Elias had become more than just a companion. He was a partner in this, someone who had thrown his lot in with hers, someone who hadn't hesitated when she needed help. She had lost so much, everything, in fact, but with him by her side, she felt as though she could at least try to rebuild. "I trust you," she said softly, the words carrying more weight than she'd intended. It wasn't just the mechanics of their survival that had drawn her to him, it was something deeper. He had become a constant in her life, the only person she could rely on. Elias glanced at her then, his expression softening for a brief moment before he returned his focus to the controls. "We've got this," he said simply. For the next few days, the journey was mostly uneventful. The ship's course was adjusted several times to avoid any potential encounters with Zidarian patrols or pirate factions that roamed the empty reaches of space. Elias worked tirelessly, making sure they were well hidden, ensuring their path remained undetected. Lyra, in the meantime, spent her time reviewing the fragmented messages she had decoded, trying to extract any more details she could about her people's location. There were still gaps in the data, but she could feel the pieces coming together. They were close. It wasn't until the fourth day into their journey that they encountered their first major obstacle. Lyra had been resting in the small quarters she had claimed as her own, her mind drifting through thoughts of the future, of what awaited them. She had allowed herself a moment to think about the possibility of reuniting with the survivors, to feel a connection to something greater than herself, something worth fighting for. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden alarm, blaring through the ship's interior. Elias's voice came over the comms, his tone tight, with urgency. "Lyra, we've got company. Multiple ships on an intercept course. We're not going to outrun them on this heading." Her heart skipped a beat. The reality of what they had been avoiding, what Lyra had known would eventually happen, was finally upon them. The Zidarians had found them. Elias cursed under his breath, quickly making adjustments to the ship's systems, rerouting power to the engines as he tried to accelerate. But there was no mistaking the fact that they were outnumbered. The Zidarian ships were closing in fast. Lyra's hand instinctively reached for the weapon she had stashed nearby. She hadn't used it in years, but it was comforting to know it was within reach. "Get to the cockpit," Elias shouted through the comms. "We're going to have to fight our way out of this. Stay close, and don't do anything reckless." Lyra's pulse quickened as she ran to the cockpit, her heart racing. The sight before her was enough to send a surge of fear through her. On the radar, four Zidarian ships loomed ominously, their dark silhouettes growing ever larger as they approached. There was no mistaking it, they had been spotted, and now the Zidarians were on their tail. "They've locked onto us," Elias said, his voice strained. "We can't outrun them without giving away our position. We're going to have to outmaneuver them." Lyra quickly strapped herself into the co-pilot's seat, her hands shaking with adrenaline. The time for running was over. It was time to fight. Chapter 8: The Battle for Survival. The Zidarian ships were closing in with terrifying speed. Their advanced technology outmatched anything Elias and Lyra had at their disposal, and they had no way of knowing what kind of firepower the enemy would bring to bear. Elias's fingers flew across the control panels, calculating the best escape routes and adjusting their ship's systems to mask their signature as much as possible. But it wasn't enough. The Zidarians were relentless. "We're not going to outrun them," Elias muttered to himself, his brow furrowed in concentration. Lyra could feel the pressure mounting. She knew they couldn't keep running forever, but the thought of facing the Zidarians head-on filled her with dread. They were an enemy unlike any other, efficient, calculated, and vicious. Her people had never been trained for open combat. They had been explorers, peaceful stargazers, not warriors. And yet, here she was, thrust into the middle of a war she never wanted, forced to fight for her survival. The Zidarians hailed them over the comms, their voice harsh and cold. "This is your final warning, fugitive. Surrender and prepare to be boarded. Resistance is futile." Lyra's grip on the console tightened, her heart pounding. She had heard that voice before, the voice of the Zidarian commander, the same one who had led the destruction of her home. He was here, hunting her down, determined to finish what he had started. Elias didn't hesitate. He activated the defensive shields, primed the weapon systems, and took a deep breath. "We don't have a choice now," he said. "Get ready. They're coming in hot." Before Lyra could respond, the first volley of enemy fire erupted, splintering across their shields. The ship rocked violently, throwing both of them against their seats. The comms crackled with static, followed by the roar of weapons fire. Elias's hands were a blur as he navigated the ship through a series of evasive maneuvers. "Hold on," Elias shouted, his voice tight. "They're not making this easy." Lyra gripped the side of her seat, her breath shallow as the ship lurched again, evading another blast. The Zidarians were closing in, their weapons charging for another round of fire. "Can you disable their targeting system?" Lyra asked, her voice urgent. Elias nodded, even though he knew how risky it was. "I can try, but it'll be a one-shot deal. If I fail, we're done for." The ship swerved and twisted as Elias fought to maintain control, weaving in and out of the incoming fire. Lyra's heart raced in her chest, but she couldn't afford to be afraid. Her people were depending on her now. She couldn't back down. "Do it," she urged, her voice low but steady. Elias's hands moved faster, and with a quick surge of energy, He fired a shot from the ship's electromagnetic disruptor. The shot hit one of the Xidarian ships dead on, frying its targeting system. The enemy ship's fire was thrown off course, missing them by inches. Lyra's pulse quickened. They had a chance. The Xidarians were furious now, their communications blaring with threats, but Elias and Lyra were already one step ahead. Elias took advantage of their confusion, firing back with everything they had. The small, nimble ship zigged and zagged, narrowly avoiding the incoming blasts, while Elias fired with calculated precision. One of the enemy ships exploded in a burst of flame, a bright, fiery blossom against the dark backdrop of space. "We're not done yet," Elias muttered under his breath, but there was a flicker of triumph in his eyes. They had won the first round, but there were still 3 more ships to contend with. Chapter 9. The Aftermath. The battle was far from over, and the remnants of the chaos still echoed in the void. The first Xidarian ship had been destroyed, a fiery explosion lighting up the space around them. But the remaining 3 ships were not going to give up so easily. Elias and Lyra had just bought themselves some time, but they both knew that time was a luxury they couldn't afford. The Xidarians would regroup, adapt, and come after them with everything they had. Elias's eyes flicked between the controls, his mind racing. The ship was still intact, but barely. Their shields were down to a quarter of their strength, and their weapon systems were functioning, but not at full capacity. He knew that if they didn't make a plan soon, they wouldn't make it out alive. "Lyra, I need you to do something," Elias said urgently, his hands still gripping the controls as the ship shuddered under another barrage of enemy fire. "I need you to get to the rear of the ship, the auxiliary control panel. I can't keep this up alone. If you can help me disable their remaining ship's communications, we might be able to break their formation." Lyra's heart raced as she processed his words. Her knowledge of alien technology was limited, but she knew her people had worked with powerful systems. This wasn't just a technical issue, it was a matter of trust. They needed each other. There was no time for second-guessing. "I'm on it," she replied, her voice sharp and determined. She didn't hesitate, even though the weight of the situation pressed heavily on her chest. She grabbed the emergency harness from the wall and made her way to the rear of the ship. Every step felt like an eternity as she moved through the narrow passageways of the ship. The sound of the Xidarian ships outside their weapons fire, the low hum of their engines felt like a drumbeat echoing in her mind. She reached the control panel, and her hands moved quickly, scanning the array of unfamiliar systems. She had to act fast. With the limited knowledge she had, she interfaced with the ship's emergency protocols, sending a burst of energy through the comms systems to disrupt the Xidarian ship's ability to communicate. As she worked, Elias held the line at the controls, pushing their ship to its limits. The Xidarians had regrouped, and they were coming in strong. But they had a new advantage now. Elias's hands moved quickly, targeting one of the ships, still firing relentlessly at them. With Lyra's help, their systems became a fortress. The Xidarian ships couldn't communicate with each other, and in that split second of disarray, they became vulnerable. Elias grinned, the tension in his chest loosening for just a moment. "Got you now," he yelled as he fired another shot, this time aimed at the weak point of the second ship. The blast hit true, sending the Xidarian vessel into a spiraling descent. It exploded in a brilliant burst of light, scattering debris across the stars. Lyra returned to the cockpit just in time to see the second enemy ship disintegrate. Her heart was pounding, but a sense of exhilaration rushed through her. They were winning. "We've still got 2 left," Elias said, his voice steady but filled with purpose. "But they're disoriented. Let's finish this." The remaining 2 Xidarian ships tried to regroup, but the disarray in their ranks was enough to give Elias and Lyra the upper hand. Elias maneuvered the ship through a series of evasive moves, his hands a blur on the controls. Lyra watched closely, her mind racing as she anticipated the next move, her heart steady in the face of the battle. With one final, precise shot, Elias took down the third ship. The remaining Xidarian vessel attempted to flee, but Lyra's mind was already calculating the trajectory. They couldn't let it escape. Not after all they had been through. "I've got this," Lyra said, her voice filled with determination. She quickly accessed the targeting systems and hacked into the Xidarian ship's navigation. With a flick of her fingers, the ship's engines were forced to overload, sending it spiraling toward a nearby asteroid field. The final ship vanished in a fiery explosion as it collided with the rocky debris. The silence that followed was deafening. Elias exhaled sharply, his hands still gripping the controls, but his body finally relaxing. They had done it. They had won. Lyra collapsed into the co-pilot's seat beside him, her body tense but grateful. "Is it over?" she asked softly. "For now," Elias replied, his voice steady. "We've made it through this battle, but there's still much to do." They sat in silence for a moment, both processing what had just happened. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but the war, the galaxy they were in, was far from over. The Xidarians were relentless, and their forces were vast. But Lyra and Elias had learned something in those moments of battle. They were stronger together. "We've got a long road ahead of us," Lyra said, her voice firm but tinged with something that felt almost like hope. "But I'm not alone. Not anymore." Elias smiled, glancing at her. "No, you're not." Together, they turned the ship around, setting course for the coordinates. Lyra had uncovered the hidden refuge where her people had gathered, where they would regroup and prepare for the next phase of their fight. There would be more battles, more uncertainty, but for the first time since Lyra's world had been destroyed, she felt the weight of her past lifting. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was fighting for something greater. And for the first time, she felt like she was moving forward not as a fugitive or an orphan but as a leader. The journey ahead was filled with challenges, but they weren't facing them alone anymore. Together, Elias and Lyra were going to take the fight to the Xidarians. They were going to take back the galaxy, and they would never stop fighting for their people, for each other.